Molasses. Sticky, sweet, viscous, perfect for all your baking needs. Though, too much of anything can prove deadly. In today's story, cutting corners to save a little bit of money ends in tragedy involving a devastating wave of death and destruction. Our story takes us to the north end of Boston in the year 1914. It's a bustling community of Italian and Irish immigrants. We're near the sea. You can hear the waves lapping against the harbour wall, and you can hear trains rumbling along on the track in the distance. At the time, there was a huge demand for molasses. You see, France and Britain were at war with Germany. World War I had just broken out, and so they needed munitions, lots of the stuff. But what has this got to do with molasses, I hear you ask? Well, and this was news to me, but apparently molasses can be distilled into industrial alcohol, and this is one of the main ingredients in the production of munitions, particularly explosives like dynamite. Because of the war, the production of munitions was becoming a booming industry in America, and lots of companies wanted a slice of the pie. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was one of these, and from their name, I'm sure you've guessed it, they produced industrial alcohol. To increase their efficiency, and also maximise their profits, they had a fabulous idea. They were going to build an absolutely ginormous molasses storage tank with a capacity of 8.7 million litres. And so now I have to introduce you to one of the main characters in our story, Arthur Gell. Unfortunately, I couldn't seem to find any pictures of him, but he was put in charge of overseeing construction of this mammoth tank. An architect or engineer, you might think, but oh no, he didn't have any relevant qualifications or experience to speak of. He was, get this, a treasurer. Now this is practically like getting my cat to do brain surgery. Okay, so maybe not as bad as that, but pretty close. Now the company had chosen the absolute most perfect location for the tank, and in terms of logistics, the setup they had planned would be absolutely amazing. They would build the tank on Commercial Street by the waterfront, close to the ships that would bring in molasses from lovely warm places like Cuba, Puerto Rico and the West Indies. And it would be close to the railroad, which would transport the molasses to their distillery, which was 1 mile away. Very convenient. Unfortunately, the location of the tank was also perfect for a rather unsavoury reason. Many of the residents were immigrants and they were not allowed to vote, and so they couldn't put up much of a fight against the construction of this mammoth tank. The race to complete the tank was on. The tank absolutely had to be finished by the 31st of December 1915. On this day, a steamship would be arriving from Cuba, filled to the brim with precious molasses that would need a new home. Unfortunately, it was as if the gods were conspiring against Gell. This project was plagued with setback after setback. The negotiations to secure a lease on the waterfront location, they took months. This was precious time that Gell simply did not have. Gell contracted Hammond Iron Works to plan and build the tank for a rather reasonable sum of $30,000, around $900,000 in today's money. Now, luckily for Gell, the tank was designated as a receptacle and not a building, and this meant that he didn't have to waste time applying for silly things, like building permits or getting certification by engineers. I mean, who needs an engineer when you have a treasurer? Okay, I've got nothing against treasurers, but occasionally people should probably stay in their lane. The clock was ticking and Gell refused to miss his deadline. He specifically instructed the Hammond Iron Works company to rush the project. It's just a recipe for disaster. Extra crew members were employed and crews worked around the clock. On the 8th of December 1915, disaster struck. Tragically, the tank would claim its first life. A 35-year-old crew member fell into the tank, a 40-foot drop. Now this tragedy, of course, it shook the workers. They were frightened, cautious. They didn't want to share their friend's fate. And so, for a while, construction slowed to a snail's pace. Next, there was a storm. It was dubbed a superstorm by the papers. There was flooding and power lines were torn down. Construction had to stop. Then they resumed and there was another storm. Gell just couldn't catch a break. Finally, the finish line was nearly in sight. The last leg of the race was to test the tank for leaks by filling it to the top with water. But the deadline was fast approaching. It would likely take weeks to fill the tank, and it would be very expensive. As we know, profits, they come before safety. So Gell had a fabulous idea. Instead of filling the tank, he would run in a mere 6 inches of water. And guess what? After his thoroughly, absolutely watertight test, there were no leaks. And so the tank was of course safe. It was ready for action and Gel had met his deadline. Now, this monstrosity, I really think that's the only word I can use to describe it, was huge. It could hold 8.7 million litres of molasses. That's just too much for me to comprehend. So I had a little Google, and apparently that's about as much as 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. It was 15 metres high, which is apparently as tall as the Hollywood sign, and it was 73 metres in circumference. Painted a depressing shade of grey, it towered over the town, casting a long and ominous shadow. Now, the next important person in our story is Isaac Gonzalez. He worked for USIA, and he was kind of like a general handyman. Now, Isaac was smart. He knew there was something wrong with the tank. He heard it groan and felt it quake every time molasses was unloaded into it. He'd worked with molasses before. He knew the sound it made when it fermented. But this was different, unsettling. Steel flakes would peel off the walls of the tank and molasses would seep out of the seams on a daily basis, a reminder to Isaac that disaster could strike at any moment. The children in the area, unaware of the potential danger it signalled, they loved the dripping molasses. They would flock to the tank ready to collect their sweet, sticky treat. They would dip sticks into pools of it on the ground and excitedly slurp it up. I would have been there every day for my free molasses fix. Isaac knew something had to be done. He pleaded with Gel and his direct manager, Mr. White. He brought the rusty steel flakes, he told them of the groans, the quaking, the leaks and the children. And I'm sure you can predict Gel's reaction. He was unenthused. He dismissed Isaac's claims. The tank was safe, it was sturdy. I mean, he had tested it with a whole 6 inches of water. His main concern was that Isaac needed to do a better job of keeping the children from trespassing. He definitely had his priorities straight. He made it clear that if Isaac were to continue wasting his time with his silly complaints, he would be fired. So, what did Gel do in response to Isaac's concerns? Well, he had part of the tank recaulked, and then he had a genius idea, a pure light bulb moment. He would paint the tank brown, so you couldn't see the molasses leaking anymore. I mean, if you can't see it, it's not there, right? Disaster averted. I wonder if I could paint all my problems away. That'd be nice. Anyway, carrying on, Isaac was beside himself with worry about the tank. It had even started to impact on his marriage. He'd warned Gel and White, but they weren't going to do anything sensible, and so it was up to him. He started visiting the tank at night time, opening one of the valves and discharging molasses into the harbour in the hopes that it would relieve some of the pressure. He knew this was frivolous. It wasn't going to do much, but it at least gave him a little peace of mind. Now, this Isaac fellow, he really had the town's back. He sometimes used to even sleep in the office next to the tank. This was not part of his job description, I might add. He hoped that he'd be able to raise the alarm if disaster were to strike, so that people would be given enough warning so that they could evacuate. At the time, anarchists had been active around the country, and there'd even been a few attacks in the north end of Boston. Now, this tank might as well have had a huge bullseye target plastered on it due to its involvement in the production of munitions for the war. And one night, while Isaac was watching over the tank, the phone rang. He picked it up, and on the other end of the line was a man with a raspy voice.
"Are you the supervisor of the molasses tank in Commercial Street?"
they asked.
"No, I'm just a worker,"
replied Isaac. The caller grew angry.
"You're a damned liar. We're going to dynamite the tank."
This, of course, struck fear into Isaac. It would be an unmitigated disaster if the tank were blown up, so he sprung into action, quickly calling the police. The police rushed to the scene to begin an investigation, and they even decided to stay the night just in case anarchists did indeed attempt to blow up the tank. Luckily, huge sigh of relief, no attack materialised. Isaac had had enough. There's only so much stress that one man can take, and to be honest, I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did. But to save his own well-being and also his marriage, he quit his job at the USIA. Well done, Isaac. A job is never worth sacrificing your health over. On the 12th of January 1919, the Miliero, the crown jewel of the USIA steamships, docked into the harbour, filled to the brim with molasses. It contained 5 million litres of the stuff, 2 million of which would be pumped into the monster tank, and this took over 24 hours. The tank began to groan and quake, more so than usual, and this filled those around it with a sense of unease. The Puleo had come from the Caribbean, the molasses were warm, and these were mixing with the cold pudding-like molasses that had been in the tank for weeks. This mixing would set into action a terrible chain of events. It would cause fermentation, which produces gas. The pressure in the tank would build and build. The tank had also been filled to near full capacity, 8.7 million litres, weighing a hefty 12 million kilograms, almost half as heavy as the Statue of Liberty, including her base. If only Gel and White had heeded Isaac's warnings. On the 15th of January 1919, the tank could take the building pressure no longer. It gave way, unleashing a huge tsunami of black sticky molasses. It was 8 metres tall and it travelled at an astonishing 35 miles per hour. The rivets that held the tank together, they pinged off with such force they were like bullets, and huge pieces of the tank flew off in all directions, one piece cutting through a column that held up the elevated railroad, causing it to collapse and sag towards the ground. One train narrowly managed to escape disaster. It had just passed that destroyed section of track moments before the impact. The brakeman, Royal Albert Lehman, quickly pulled the emergency cord. He leapt out of the train and looked on in horror as he saw another train was approaching. He very courageously stepped out into the middle of the tracks, flailing his arms wildly, screaming, "Stop, stop, the track is down." The screech of metal against metal could be heard as the train gradually drew to a halt. Lehman had just saved many, many lives. A 10-year-old boy was collecting firewood near the tank while his father was watching him from his apartment window. He looked on in horror as his son was swallowed up by the viscous wave. This wave, it crushed buildings, freight cars, wagons, trapped people and animals alike. The Globe reported that the force of the tank giving way lifted up a house and sent it careening onto Commercial Street, where it collapsed in a heap, and unfortunately it claimed the life of a 65-year-old woman. Further reports were that the firehouse was torn up from its foundations and nearly flung into the harbour. Unfortunately, a firefighter was trapped under the debris and he was unable to make it out alive. Within 5 minutes, there was nothing left of the North End waterfront except for a sea of molasses. Rescue teams rushed to the scene, firefighters, police, and over 100 sailors who were luckily in ships that were moored in the harbour. When they arrived at the scene, what they saw would truly shock them. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. There was a massive rush to try and rescue the trapped victims. The cold winter air had caused the molasses to thicken. It had begun to harden. Firefighters climbed out over ladders that were outstretched over the congealing molasses, careful to not fall in themselves. Shots rang out as horse after horse had to be put down. Tragically, 21 people lost their lives that day. Cleanup was a lengthy process. Salt water had to be pumped in from the harbour to try and cut through the molasses. Even the water in the harbour was stained brown. Now, 300 people were involved in cleaning up this mess and searching this sticky sea for survivors and also bodies. Tragically, the final body was found 4 months later in the harbour. A lengthy legal battle would then ensue. 119 separate claims were brought against the USIA, and these were consolidated into one legal proceeding. This would last for over 5 years. Colonel Hugh Ogden was appointed auditor for the case. He would hear the evidence and then he would issue a report to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. USIA were adamant that anarchists had blown up the tank. And the plaintiffs, well, they claimed the tank was structurally unsound and it was negligently built in a densely populated area. The evidence against the USIA was damning. The steel plates that were delivered by the Hammond Iron Company, they were 10% thinner than what was promised. But Gell wasn't an engineer, so he couldn't tell. Next, there was an MIT report that stated that the tank was improperly designed and its failure was entirely due to structural weakness. It also said that the steel plates were not thick enough and also the number of rivets holding the tank together was insufficient. Given the evidence, Ogden concluded that USIA was liable for the disaster. The tank had given way due to structural weakness and not an attack by anarchists. In the end, USIA and the plaintiffs reached a private agreement for $628,000, around $11 million in today's money. Definitely not enough given the level of suffering, loss of life, and just the general devastation that was caused. Thankfully, this disaster does have a little bit of a silver lining. It's terrible that so many people had to die for this to happen, but it did revolutionise building regulations. Any plans for significant constructions now had to be certified by a professional engineer, and I'm sure that this prevented a lot of catastrophes going forward. Thankfully, that tank was never rebuilt, and in its place stands a lovely recreational complex. Today, all that serves to commemorate this terrible disaster is a small, unassuming wreath sign. Though, rumour has it that on a warm day, the sweet smell of molasses still lingers on. If you got something from this video, a like and subscribe would be very much appreciated. Stay safe, don't cut corners, it can be deadly, and I hope you have a magnificent day.